Welcome to Philosophy of Action. Today, I'd like to continue on the uncomfortable question of why should we fight for Europe. Today, I'd like to ask the question of what comes before that. What happened? Why did Europe become weak? Because the consequences of that weakness are now obvious to everyone. So instead of slogans, I want an explanation. And for this, I'd have to make three short videos. There are many possible answers. You could talk about geography, about history, about internal politics, but in my view, Europe's weakness begins directly after World War II, during the Cold War period. At least the current state of European weakness. And it became weak in two ways, first of which being moral. After the war, and somewhat before as well, Europe fundamentally changed how it understood itself. Western Europe in particular became deeply concerned with human rights, morality, effectively being nice and on the right side of history. It became far more important to feel morally good than to pursue concrete interests of its own people. Within what is essentially a Christian liberal framework, Europe shifted away from national interests and toward universal concerns, caring not primarily about Europeans, or rather about their own national populations. Britain no longer cared about British people, well, of course it did to a certain extent, but far less so than about the world, and to a certain extent Europe as a whole. After all, Britain gave up its whole empire just to stop Germany. And once you adopt that kind of worldview, something changes. You start limiting yourself. You start constraining what your nations are allowed to do. You begin treating power itself as morally suspicious. This mostly applies to Western Europe, though. Eastern Europe has this problem far less, though it has others. But the result is the same. Europe voluntarily restricts its own ability to act in the world. Not because it has to, but because it believed it was wrong not to constrict its own ability to enforce its will upon others. A perfect example of this is decolonization. Britain and France didn't just lose their empires, at least most of the time. They gave them up. Sometimes independence wars were fought, but they were mostly fought against empires who were already willing and looking at giving up those expensive imperial possessions. Colonialism came to be seen as morally abhorrent, as denying self-determination and as exploitation, therefore being evil. Whether that view is correct or not isn't even the point. It's what matters that follows. Once Britain decided that empire itself was immoral, a simple question arose. Why maintain a large empire at all? Why keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers? Why pay enormous defense budgets? Why maintain power projection through navies? If using force for national interests is morally unacceptable, or rather, if using force to enforce your will on others for your own national interests is morally unacceptable, then military strength becomes pointless. And once that logic sets in, decline becomes inevitable. And not just Britain had this problem. Most Western European nations had. Germany had its shame from the Second World War. And, for example, the Netherlands, after the loss of Indonesia, also saw no point in keeping even a small military going, which admittedly it already had a weak military. Europe didn't lose its power. It gave it up.